Jonathan Smith, who is the founder and CTO of Civic. They're doing identity and, on blockchain. So with that, welcome, Jonathan. You have two Jonathans today.
It's working. Hello? Yeah. Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So, you know, what got you into the blockchain space to begin with? I know you're obviously a technologist for many years. What was the turning point to get you starting to work on blockchain?
I don't think there's a very significant story that's different. It's probably similar to most people. Bitcoin obviously was the first thing that I looked at, and perhaps there's some background from banking. I went through the financial crisis. I've been working in investment banks for a large portion of my career, and understanding the financial system and then its demise, you know, that's when Bitcoin started to sort of come into my inbox on a more regular basis. And then when, in about 2013, I decided to really get into the technical weeds of how it worked. And it just became very obvious that this was a very powerful technology for the future. And I think when we decided to start Civic in 2015, you know, some of this comes from my background in South Africa, my co-founder Vinny, his background in South Africa, voting, and how, especially in the developing world, how easy it is to manipulate it was, well, what can we actually solve that problem somehow with blockchain? And well, blockchain is the perfect solution for that kind of system. So we started looking at that, and we started talking to government officials, starting to see, well, why can't we do digital voting? You have interesting things in the US where people abroad can just fax in or email ballots and things like this. Like, well, surely we can do better than this. And we looked at that, and basically it's a 10-year roadmap to actually get there, I think. And that's what we discovered speaking to...
And to clarify, when you're saying that, the problem that you're trying to solve, what do you mean by the 10-year roadmap?
So trying to solve voting in itself is largely fraught with regulation. Forget the technical side. I think we'll figure out the technical side. Yeah. But the regulations, getting governments comfortable with it, we're a long way from that. And it's not necessarily the best way to do a startup if your deliverables in 10 years. So, but what we really saw the problem is that you have to solve before any of that even happens is identity. That's fundamental. And then you start unwrapping that box, and you start seeing the impact everywhere. And I think everyone in this room probably is fully aware. And over the past couple of years, everybody, certainly in America, knows of the problems with identity, whether it be Facebook, whether it be the Equifax hack, Anthem, you name it, the list goes on. So the importance of that, what it can do across the board, across the world, is quite fundamental. And just to keep on that point, when you look at identity in the sense of just being able to be empowered to do business, to get yourself out of poverty, etc., it's actually a fundamental problem for people who are unable to get themselves out of dire situations. There was a very interesting talk done in TEDx last year around the homeless people in San Francisco and how big a problem identity is for them and getting access to goods and services. So the human implications are huge, and that's, you know, identity is the problem to solve. Voting is a byproduct of that.
Yeah. No, I love how you're really focusing on the problem, and, you know, ultimately, regardless if you're using blockchain or not, there needs to be a problem that needs to be solved, right? So, you know, when you started thinking through identity, maybe articulate again, like why does that even matter? You know, when we're all used to putting all our information on Facebook anyways, and, you know, companies know more about us than we probably think they do. Why is our self-sovereign identity even important?
So, I think it's identity is really a means to get access to goods and services at the end of the day. And although objectively, I think if you ask anybody, do you care about identity? Do you care about the fact that your identity is obviously everyone says yes. But that doesn't stop people putting their identity everywhere, because at the end of the day, what's important to people is to get quick access to goods and services.
Right.
So for the large majority of people, they will still do this. It was interesting to see after the Facebook debacle, quickly there was a big drop in share price. I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense, because no one's actually going to really care. Yes, there's a bit of media hype and people saying, okay, close your Facebook accounts. But it very quickly came back up. Why? Because people want Facebook more than they want their identities to be secret in general.
Outrage only lasts so long.
Yeah. So fixing identity is less about, it's more about empowering people to decide how their identity is used, giving them the ability to open up new use cases. I think it's very important that we need to stop thinking about, okay, if you can fill in a form quicker to open a bank account, that's, yeah, okay, you don't open bank accounts every single day. What we need to do is make identity more transparent, more usable, more private in the sense that I can decide who has access to my data. That's much more important than just being able to have quick transactions. And then opening up new use cases that you can do with identity. If you make identity cheap, if you make it something that's more of a background service, that everywhere you go, you just use it in the background, but it's safe, it's secure, there's a lot of things you can do. You know, an example of something that we were working on is a vending machine for alcohol. And we did a prototype of that and launched it at Consensus earlier this year. And that's more than just a gimmick. It shows that once identity is much more easily accessible, you can do a lot more. You can get a lot more service out of your identity in a more private way, in a more useful way, if you actually create things like blockchain-based identity.
Definitely, definitely. So how many people bought from that vending machine?
We emptied it a few times, I won't lie.
Is that quality control? No, that's great. So, you know, we're talking about identity and the ability to permission. Why, in your eyes, does that need to be a decentralized aspect? Why can't we just trust, you know, other people to manage or corporations to manage our identity?
So, the decentralized part of it is one part of the puzzle. But the first thing you have to do is give ownership to people. And this is where the cryptography pieces come in, being able to have a private key that owns that part of your identity. Your social security number is valuable because it's based on what somebody knows, not on what someone can prove they own. So by putting a private key behind it, you effectively have to prove ownership of it. So that's one part. You don't need a decentralized system for that.
Yeah.
Where decentralized systems become very, very much more useful is, one, they become global. They become, you know, in the same way that you can't control, no central government really can control Bitcoin, things like that. It's important that if we want a globally usable identity, that the FBI can't come down and shut down another country's passports, for example, just because they happen to be on a US-based centralized system.
Yeah.
So for it to actually have global legs, it has to be trustless.
Yeah.
And it also, to have true anonymity and privacy around it, you can't have central entities controlling this. Facebook, when you use Facebook, log in with Facebook Connect, they know everywhere you go and everything you do. That limits its use.
Yeah.
And so what you need to have, you can bring in the privacy elements with blockchain, but you can also bring in revocability, which is also really, really important. If I issue you with an identity and I'm the one, let's say it's the DMV, as the DMV, I need to have the right to remove your driver's license as well. And so it's really important. It's not just a key on my phone that I can hand over, because then how do I verify as a third party that this is still valid? So the blockchain allows you those mechanisms, as well as taking away control from central authorities. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So, you know, with that, what do you think the decentralized world looks like in the future when it comes to identity? What's future state?
I mean, the future state is identity as a seamless part of your daily lives. You know, I don't want to go too futuristic and say at birth you get implanted with a chip and all that. Yes, that probably will come, but that's not, in the more near term, I think your phone firstly is going to become a key source of this. It will be more embedded. We will get to a point where the cell phone manufacturers are leveraging this technology, putting it at the hardware level in the devices. We're seeing a lot of work in the hardware space right now. We've recently announced a partnership with Telefonica and Rivets, which is really all about low-level securing of data. And then for cell phone companies, it's very important to be able to have good identity solutions within their networks. So that's hopefully going to bear a lot of fruit next year for us.
Is that anything like that that episode of Black Mirror, or no?
No.
Actually, and kind of touching on that, right? So it made me think about what's going on in China with the ranking system of people, right? I'm sure you've obviously heard about that.
Of course.
So it sounds like that's kind of like a centralized way to handle identity. Is there a decentralized way you think that we start ranking humans?
I mean,
Not
of
to
course
take it
you
in a
can.
weird
And there
direction,
was,
but
I can't remember the name of that project. That was actually the whole intent of the project was to do that, allow you to, and it got stopped. I can't remember the exact reasons, but that is always a risk. There's going to be a lot of unintended consequences. The same as there are, you bring in regulations, there will be unintended consequences. You know, I think GDPR is great. We don't know what the bad parts of GDPR will be yet. That being said, you know, the US is looking at adopting very similar things. So I think a lot of the whole reward culture, I can't remember who it was that mentioned something about voting on blockchains and you could buy votes and things like that. That is a reality. We have to figure out ways to get rid. But I think it's more important that these problems come up and they come up quicker. We shouldn't be scared of this. Yes, there will be people who sell their data out of desperation potentially, because now I can just, okay, I'll give you all my identity data, just give me a couple of bucks. We have that happening in black markets already today with organs, and that's terrible things. And yes, there will be those unintended consequences, but I think the benefits far outweigh the problems that we'll see.
most definitely, most definitely. With that, I want to move into Identitycom. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Identitycom is basically our entire token ecosystem and the marketplace that we're building. We've moved over to Identity.com now. The point of Identity.com is really to create a marketplace where you have what we call identity validators. These are companies, like your standard companies today, whether it be LexisNexis or even Equifax and these kind of companies that do identity verification on individuals, that they can participate and sell their services through a marketplace. And if you take that broader, there's a lot of companies that we can empower to sell this kind of data, which is things like banks.
Right.
They have a lot of very important data about you that they should be able to give to you to take elsewhere for other entities to trust. So any entity, any company, any person who has data that they want to be able to monetize, they can do this in the marketplace. On the other side of the equation, you have the identity requesters who want to get information from users. And you know, even if it's just basic KYC, what they're able to do here is the user comes along and is pointed to an identity validator at the end of the day that this identity requester trusts. They get their identity validated and they can reuse this identity within the network. So if I have my Citibank and Citibank is in the network, I can then take my Civic identity with Citibank credentials. I can give it to, let's say, a vending machine to prove that I'm over 21 and I can get this alcohol. And now the identity validator who originally verified that gets a small amount of money based on whatever they charge in the network for providing that service. This all is done anonymously. There's smart contracts in there as well to control, make sure everybody is being paid. And we have an interesting white paper that we've been updating recently on the game theory that we're going to be putting into this ecosystem that prevents bad behavior, because it's very important to have a self-governing ecosystem as well, so that you get rid of that incentive to misbehave. And we're going to see, and I think that's going to become very popular in truly decentralized ecosystems.
Yeah, so it sounds like a tokenized network, right?
It is. I mean, our Civic token is used as the for the monetary pieces of this, for the incentivization, for the staking pieces of this ecosystem. And it's very, very important. That's what these economies should be for. These token economies really need to be stable financial layers on top of blockchains for proper economic use cases.
Yeah, and so, you know, right into that, what do you think it takes to get mass adoption when it comes to not just blockchain, but specifically, you know, identity being on the blockchain?
There's two things. One is regulation. That's sort of the easy thing. You put a nice regulation in there that forces companies and people to adopt. It's certainly an easy way to do it. The other is actual utility. You have to give, the user has to see benefit from this. It is a lot of these, a lot of blockchain projects are difficult because they're two-sided marketplaces.
Yeah.
You know, the one side won't work with you until the other side is well established, and vice versa. So adoption will come through ability to get benefit as a consumer. And that's, like I said earlier, the ability to open a bank account more quickly is not going to drive adoption.
Right.
And specifically won't drive reuse.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Definitely. All right, with that, I'd like to start opening it up for questions. Go ahead, Perla.
Hello. So my question is about the specific value proposition from Civic as opposed to, or, other platforms like, for example, Sovereign. Like, what is the differentiator between you guys and them?
I think one of the main things that we are focused on is really the user experience piece of the puzzle. We're all part of, for example, the Distributed Identity Foundation. We're all working towards the same end goals of identity. We're just approaching it in slightly different ways. I think we are very much focused on consumer use case adoption. That's, I think, for a lot of blockchain projects and a lot of the reasons why blockchain projects don't go mainstream is because their user experience is terrible for the man in the street. And so we really feel that, that's why I keep bringing up the vending machine example. It's something you can use every day. You go, you tap your phone, you get a beer. That is something that is meaningful, and blockchain projects need to think about that in general. And I think a big differentiating factor as well is our marketplace. We are trying not to compete directly with identity providers. We don't want to be an identity verification company. That's not our goal. What we're doing is creating a marketplace where all of these providers can join. I'd love to see Sovereign, I'd love to see Uport, I'd love to see all of these companies coming into the ecosystem as well, and us being able to share. This is why we're adopting similar standards like DID, like verifiable credentials with the W3C. We are more and more adopting these standards because we believe interoperability is going to be key. Not one player is going to completely own the space.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in the voting part, and how long do you think it will take before the political will to change the regulatory frameworks to support voting? Is this going to be that it has to be ubiquitous in terms of a voting solution that is immutable?
I think we are far away from that. I think people would like to see it. If you talk to companies that are actually trying to solve this right now, they probably think 2-3 years away. I think we're more closer to 5 to 10 years away. The system right now, from a US perspective, is not that terrible. I mean, we can point fingers and we can see, there's all the Russian hacking potential and all of that. But before you move to a truly digital solution, which will be open to just as much PR nightmares as you have today, I think it's not the biggest problem for the US to focus on, so I think it will take time. There are other countries where this is much more beneficial. I think you'll start seeing these attempts at doing this in smaller countries. Estonia has done a lot more in the blockchain space from a government perspective than other countries, but it's much easier when you've got a much smaller population to deal with. Yeah. I think we'll see glimmers from there.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to touch on that. So when you say the smaller populations, do you see that also as a way for those governments to compete, new technology and so forth? Or
potentially. I mean, Estonia is using it as a way that any business can come and immediately open up a bank account, start doing business just by getting this ID. It's an interesting way to compete. I'm seeing a lot of countries, smaller countries, looking at mechanisms to do this. There are also a lot of countries that are likely, if they don't solve some of the corruption problems, to get shut out of international markets. And they need to do something quick to do this. I don't want to necessarily speak to the countries that are doing things because I'm not sure what's public and what's not. But that's why we get approached by some of these countries in the identity space to reform some of their identity systems.
Yeah. I think we got a question over here.
Thank you. A good part of our identity comes from the government, from birth to death. How are you dealing, or how are you approaching government as a source of a validated identity and dealing with a myriad of, you have 50 states just within the states and then countries and endless number of them. So how are you dealing with that?
We're not, really, is the answer. We are not targeting them as our key customers. I think this is also what differentiates us a bit from other companies is, the governments are a long sales cycle, very difficult. To spend your business resources to get government contracts in this space in such a nice technology, I think, we don't think that that's the best use of our time and resources. At the end of the day, they're going to issue driver's license. Don't get me wrong, we talk to them, we're working with the bodies to make sure we're known. But a driver's license is good enough for any company to take. We need to digitize that and make it trustworthy. We don't have to necessarily have driver's licenses issued in the very short term on blockchain to necessarily change things. I've not met anyone who is really encumbered by pulling out their driver's license to do something. Yes, there are the privacy elements that you're sharing information you shouldn't be. We can solve that without the government necessarily issuing new identities. I do think that is the long-term play. I also do think the government is not great at all forms of identity. They may know your name quite well. They may even know your date of birth quite well. They don't necessarily have the best data of where you live. I don't know how many people here, their driver's licenses actually reflect their current home address. So it really also depends on what data you need and who does the receiving party think is the best source of that information. And government's not always the best source.
Speaking of the best, we have time for one last best question. Uh-oh. How about one last good question?
I waited for the good question comment. What about healthcare? Is there anything specific you're doing in that space, and is there anything to consider that might be different than other areas where identity is required to power the market?
I mean, the healthcare industry is quite daunting. It's fraught with regulatory issues, and also there are certain key incumbents that own all this health data that don't really want to see it given away freely and in the control of users. But I think it will come. A lot of that has to come with data storage, though, more than it does with the identity pieces. So I think the solution from a healthcare perspective is more about access to records in a private and anonymized way. So where we are working on solutions for that is it's more about being able to say, okay, Stanford has issued these records. I can prove I own these records. What information do you want from these records, and give access to that? And I think that is more where we end up going from a healthcare point of view. I don't know. I'd be interested in other people who have thoughts on this as well, but identity is a small part of that problem.
I'm sure you'd be up for talking to people today about that.
Absolutely.
All right, so, fine, Rui, just because I know you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Question about accredited investors. I've heard that there is some let's just say, what do you think of the use of, I'm going to back up here. For identity, you're using DIDs, right? So to identify users. Is that the standard you guys are using?
We are moving to to adopting that standard for certain pieces.
Okay. What about the use of ERC 721 tokens, the non-fungible tokens, as a way to identify accredited investors? What are your thoughts around that?
Why specifically accredited investors?
Oh, that was just the topic of conversation. I mean, it could be used for other scenarios, but that was the scenario that we were talking about.
I haven't thought about it in that particular context. I think the problem with contracts in general, it comes down to, and there's also, there's a lot of standards that have been tried to implement on Ethereum where you put all your identity keys effectively in those contracts. And I think one of the problems you have is correlation risk with any of these contract-based solutions. Everything seems anonymous on the blockchain until eventually there's a couple of breaches, and it becomes very easy to correlate all this information. So that's an issue in general, I think. For accredited investors, what we do is we use Bitcoin, by the way, as our attestation framework. That's where we stamp all authentications. And what we do for accredited investors is that's an entry that you can then provide that shows when it was accredited, etc. And it's a Bitcoin transaction. So that's more the case we've gone down to, but I think that's more about the attestation, making sure that also it cannot be correlated with other data, which is really important.
Excellent. With that, everybody please give a round of applause for Jonathan Smith with Civic.
Thank you.